Hello there, everybody. Thank you for being patient. And welcome to the Titus Learning webinar on GDPR. My name is Ed Clemenson, and I'm an implementation consultant here at Titus Learning. So what I'll just very quickly do is give you a little bit of background information as well about Titus. So Titus Learning is a certified Moodle partner who provide tailored e-learning services for schools, colleges, organizations all around the world. So we've got clients ranging from UK state schools and colleges to international school groups supporting 50,000 plus users. And that's alongside training companies and other organizations as well. We also provide a range of services, as many of you probably already know, such as bespoke themes, integration with other systems, custom development work, hosting, training, and support services. Moving swiftly on. So what is this webinar actually going to cover? So firstly, we will have a look at GDPR. So just a quick overview of it. As you've already joined this webinar, you probably kind of already have some level of understanding of what it is. Why is it being introduced? Who does it actually affect? And what steps have Moodle actually taken, and Titus ourselves as well? What steps have we taken? We'll then spend a little bit of time actually looking at the Moodle plugins. So there's a policies and a data privacy plugin, and some steps to follow through on how to kind of correctly implement these plugins as well. You should have a Zoom group chat available as well. So if you do have any questions along the way, if you type your question into the chat, I'll try my best to pick those up on my other monitor and get them answered as I go along. If I don't, I'll answer them at the end. So firstly, GDPR, what is it and why is it being introduced? So you'll be surprised how many people don't know, but GDPR stands for General Data Protection Regulation. It's a regulation in EU law on data protection and privacy for all individuals within the European Union, but also addresses the export of personal data outside of the EU as well. And GDPR aims primarily to give control to individuals and residents over their personal data. And we'll cover that, as I say, in regards to Moodle in a lot more detail. It also becomes enforceable on the 25th of May 2018, so that date is fast approaching as well. But who does it actually affect? So GDPR not only applies to organizations located within the EU, but also applies to organizations outside of the EU, especially if they offer goods or services to EU data subjects. So data subject is just an individual that you're holding data on, essentially. And it applies to all companies processing and holding the personal data of data subjects that reside in the EU, regardless of the company's location. That can be anywhere. And in terms of what's actually classed as personal data, it's just information related to an individual or data subject, as I've used a few times, that can be used directly or indirectly to identify that particular person. So it could be name, email address, photo, bank details, posts on social networking forums, websites, medical information, or even just like a computer IP address as well. So firstly, what steps as well have we taken at Titus when we've been looking at GDPR? So in the background, we've been ensuring that our customers are kind of aware of these key changes, and we've also been installing some of these plugins on the relevant platform itself, which is what we're going to go through in more detail. So you will, if not immediately in the near future, get a chance to use these plugins yourself on Moodle if you're one of our customers. And in regards to what steps Moodle have taken, we know that they've been working with privacy and compliance specialist lawyers to help guide them forwards to make sure that the tools that they're creating are correct. They've established two specific dedicated development teams for GDPR as well, one for the policy side of things and one for the data privacy. They've even created some privacy, a privacy API so that plugins can actually request or delete personal data that these plugins store, because there's a lot of plugins available for Moodle. And as I've mentioned several times already, they've actually created and started to implement these plugins, these policies and data privacy plugins. So these are available in core version 3.5, which will be available very soon of Moodle, or as additional plugins to install for previous versions. So 3.3.5 and 3.4.2. And if you are a Titus customer, there's a very high chance that you'll be running one of those two versions. So you may already have those plugins installed. So we'll now move on to look at the two plugins themselves. So as I've already said, we've got one for policies. So this allows you to create a new user sign-on process, which we'll cover in more detail. You've got the ability to create and define multiple user acceptance policies. You'll also have the ability as an admin to track the user consents and even agree and consent on other users' behalf. And also you can manage the updates and versioning of the policies, such as making minor changes and not actually rolling those out, needing to be accepted, etc. And then we've got the data privacy side of things, so allowing users to actually submit a subject access request. So as I said, we'll cover this in more detail. This step's a little bit further on, but a subject access request is essentially going to be users that are asking for their data to be deleted or exported, in summary. Data privacy will also allow site admins and privacy officers as well to process these requests or approve or deny them, export or delete users' data. And you'll also have the ability to manage a data registry. So the ability to set categories and purposes and retention periods, so the length of time for which certain data is stored. But we will go through that. I'll load up our demo site as well and kind of move that alongside. So I'll be able to actually show you some of these areas in the platform. So in terms of the steps that we're going to look at, we're going to run through this in kind of an eight-step review, I suppose. So we're going to look at creating a data protection officer role on the platform as well. So we'll cover what it is and how it's applicable. We will then have a look at the privacy settings, such as the age of consent approval. We'll then look at the policy settings and the few external options that you potentially might want to use. We will consequently move on to looking at how you actually create these new privacy policies and agreements, and then how you manage these as well. We'll then look at how you can manage the user agreements for individual users that have actually approved or denied these. We'll then look at the data registry. So that's where you can set the length of time that certain data is held on the platform. And then to conclude, we'll have a look at subject access requests. So that's individuals on the platform being able to ask questions to the data protection officer and request their information to be sent to them or to be deleted. So we'll start with step one. So creating a data protection officer. So what is a data protection officer? Well, a data protection officer is responsible for overseeing the data protection strategy to ensure that you are actually compliant with GDPR. In Moodle terms, they can respond to data requests and manage the data registry. So it's fairly straightforward. So what we'll be able to do is actually create this role on the platform itself. So as I've said here in just 4 very quick steps, I will show you this though. The first step is actually to create a new role as a system admin with an archetype of guest. I'll bring up my other screen in a moment. You'll then need to modify the permissions and make sure that they've got these key permissions that are going to allow them access to actually manage these requests that come in. You can then create the role and then assign that role as well. So if I just drag and drop this over here, just go to the home page for now. So I've logged into this particular platform, and what I want to do is I want to go to site admin. So if I click site admin on the top navigation bar on this theme and scroll down, you'll see I've got privacy and policies here. We're going to be revisiting this area in a short while, but right now I actually want to click on users. And if I scroll down slightly, we'll see under permissions, I've got define roles, and that's where I want to be first to create this new data protection officer role. So if I click in here, what I want to do, I've got a list of my existing roles. I want to add a new role in here. So I'm going to click add a new role. And I can use a role or archetype. So in this case, I actually want to choose an archetype of guest. So you want to choose an archetype of guest when you're doing this. And click on continue. This is where you can start adding the actual name and some of the information about the role. So there isn't too much to fill in here, and you can actually ignore quite a few of these settings. So for now, I will type in data protection officer. I'll have the same short name as full name. I'm not going to enter a description, could if I wanted to. I've already set the archetype, The other important setting is here, context types where this role may be assigned. You only want a data protection officer to be assigned at a system level. So all I need to do is just tick this checkbox for system. So I've got my short name, full name, archetype of guest, and context is system. If I scroll down, a bit further down, you've got a permissions area here. So if I just minimize this window slightly, you can see on the slide here, I've got 3 key areas. There are additional ones just on the right-hand side, additional permissions that you need to allow. But I'll show you a quick example. I'll just add one of these. So manage data registry. If I expand this window, and in this filter, I just type in manage data. There we go. So I've got manage data registry, manage data requests. So I can just set these to allow, and then I could clear this and search for additional permissions and apply these permissions to this role. For now, I'm just going to hit create this role to save a bit of time so I can see my role here. That's great. What I now want to do is actually assign that role. So I've created my role. I'll go back to site admin and back to users. And just scroll down slightly under permissions. There we go. We've got assign system roles. So if I click on this, you can see my role here now. It's got a context of system level. There's no users with this role. I can click into Data Protection Officer, find that user from the list, single left click, just hit add, and I can see that now Majid Hussain is the Data Protection Officer. And I don't need to hit save, that's just applied. It's fairly straightforward to create that role. So just to reiterate, the purpose of this role is to allow an individual to manage the subject access requests and the data registry as well, which, as I said, we will cover in more detail. Any site admins will also have the access to do this as well. So what we'll do now is we will have a look at the data privacy settings. So as an administrator, and I'll bring my screen over again in a moment, if you navigate to site admin, privacy and policies, you've got a privacy settings area, which I showed you very, very briefly in the list. And the key thing to be aware of here really is choosing whether you want to utilize a digital age of consent. And this is only applicable to self-registration sites. So firstly, just to clarify, self-registration is when your platform has the ability for users to register themselves to create accounts on the platform without an admin having to approve them. So this is probably more so applicable to training companies and organizations potentially. However, in most cases, whether you're a school, university, or business, you are going to have administrators that are going to act as gatekeepers for new accounts. But this is still important, it's still worth mentioning. So if you do allow for self-registration, so users to register themselves on your platform, what you can do is you can enable the digital age of consent and actually change the digital age of consent. So a user will hit your login page or hit create new account, and they'll see a screen similar to this on the right-hand side here. So age and location verification, because you can set different restrictions depending on the country. So what is your age? You would just type that into the box, and where do you live? And you hit proceed. So that will continue the process of self-registration via your email address if you actually meet that restriction. If not, it will ask you to contact the administrator because you are essentially a digital minor. So if I just bring across my monitor, my screen onto this monitor and scroll down. So I'm in site admin again, privacy and policies. We'll be here quite a bit. You'll see there is privacy settings at the top of this list. So if I click into privacy settings, you can see the default is actually no here for digital age of consent verification. I've turned this on already. So it is no, I've turned it on. You've got the list here for digital age of consent. So you've got lots of defaults in there. So you've got the country code, and then a comma, a space, and then the age requirement. And the default is indicated by this at the top here, this star. So the default is 16. And I can change all of these values if I need to. I've also got Contact Data Protection Officer ticked, which will show a link on each user's profile page. That will be covered later in subject access requests. And I don't need to modify this particular last setting either. So I'm just going to hit Save Changes for now. Fantastic. So in a lot of cases, if self-registration isn't available on your platform, you can still have digital age consent turned on if you want to, but it won't be applicable. It won't show on your login page. So now we've had a look at the data privacy settings. We will have a look at the policy settings. When I refer to policies, I'm talking about things like user acceptance policies, privacy policies. You might have your policy on cookies potentially appear here as well. So when you create a policy, when a user logs in, they will hit your site homepage or personal dashboard, depending on the setting chosen for your particular platform. And as soon as they try to navigate anywhere, they'll be hit by this UAP in this instance, in this screenshot, this sample acceptance usage policy. They'll be able to click next or back between multiple policies, and then they will actually have to tick a checkbox and agree to it. And there is an area that they can actually leave a remark as well. But just before we get to this, I'm just going to drag on this screen again, go back to site administration, scroll down to privacy and policies. And as you can see, the next setting is policy settings. There's only 3 here. So these two policies these two options, at the bottom refer to external options. So if you're not going to use Moodle for user acceptance policies or any other policies. So by default, this is actually on core. And that means that some of the settings in that list back under site admin privacy and policies aren't actually showing. So this one's quite an important setting to remember. You want to change this to policies on the dropdown. So selecting this component to handle user agreements to site policies. We want policies tool policies. So if I just go back to site admin, by default, manage policies and use agreements do not show. It's only when we change this setting under policy settings. So consequently, that leads us on to how you actually create these privacy policies and agreements, which is what we're going to look at now. So it's another question of navigating back to site admin privacy and policies, manage policies. And you have the option to create and edit existing policies alongside choosing the type of policy and the user type as well that needs to accept the policy. So I'll explain that in a moment. You can edit policies and you can make policies inactive if you need to for a certain amount of time, or you make changes, or just create drafts. You've also got the option to mark some of your changes as minor changes. So let's say, for example, there were some spelling mistakes or some grammatical errors. You can go on, edit a particular policy, mark it as a minor change, which means that users won't have to re-accept that. So if I bring this back onto our screen. So once again, privacy and policies under site admin. I've got 2 areas here that we're going to look at. First is manage policies. So I click in here. So as you can see, I've already got a policy that exists. So it's a UAP, user acceptance policy, or user agreement policy. It's a site policy for all users. It's currently active. This is the version it's on, so 9th of May 2018 on version 2. And it was last modified this morning, not long ago, about an hour ago. And nobody's actually agreed to it yet. So there's 10 users on the platform that this is applicable to, and nobody's actually agreed to it yet. So if I want a new policy, I would click the new policy at the top left. In this case, I'm just going to edit this existing policy because the settings are the same, but it's populated. So if I click on actions on the right-hand side, this particular policy, I could set it to inactive, which will update the policy status here on the left. I can view previous versions as well. I can view it and I can edit it. So first I'm just going to view it. So you can see what it looks like on the page. I can click back or I can click edit. So I'm going to click edit now to make changes. So I've got access to change the name, and anything with this icon here is a required field as well. So when you're creating a new one, you must set these. It won't let you continue. So you've got your type. So site policy, privacy policy, third parties or other. User consent. So is it all users? Is it just authenticated users, which essentially means logged in users, or is it guests? So guests refers to guest access, because platforms can allow guest access to certain courses where you're not actually logged in. In the cases of, we use schools as a typical example, you probably will not utilize guest access at all, because you could potentially be revealing key information to non-logged in users, which you don't want, personal information rather. So you're probably best just to leave this on all users. You've got your version, which if you leave it blank, it will just update with today's date, so 9th of May. You've got your summary. So this is actually something that users will see as well. They do see the summary and the full policy. You've got the full policy itself. Obviously, you've got two rich text editors here as well. You can add images if you really want to. And because we're editing it, I can tick if I want a minor change. So if 6 out of 10 people on the previous screen had agreed to this policy, and I'd made some changes and I'd hit save, it would revert back to 0 out of 10 have accepted this particular policy. If I put minor change, it would retain that 6 people have accepted it. So I'm just going to hit save for now, even though I've not actually made any changes. You'll see it's updated the version here. We're now on version 3, and the last modified was 9:25 AM today, which is great. So that's how you actually create and edit existing policies. So what we'll now look at is how we actually review these user consents and how we can actually change these user consents or consent on other users' behalf, should I say. So once again, it's a question of being in site admin, privacy and policies, but now we're going to be looking in user agreements. So if I bring this screen back already, might as well go straight there. So site administration, privacy and policies, and we've just been in manage policies. Now we want user agreements at the bottom of this list. So if we click into user agreements, we have a list of users on the platform and how many acceptance policies have they, or privacy policies, etc., have they actually completed. So there's only one column here on the right-hand side because we only have one policy. So there'll be more columns the more policies we have. The first thing to note really is using this filter at the top right. So if I just click this drop down, you can see there's going to be an entry for any policy I've created. Do you want to filter users by everybody that can agree, that can't agree, has agreed, hasn't agreed, or a particular role? Now, personally, I think that the most useful one, again, most useful filters are going to be agreed, not agreed for status, and also a policy itself. So if I just want to check the UAP policies, or pretend there's 100 users on this site, this may only apply to say 10 of them. I've got my list of users. I can see nobody's agreed it, which is a shame. I might want to take this data to somebody else, to an admin team or an admin meeting, and say these are the individuals who have accepted it. So I can download this at any point, and there's multiple formats you can download that as well. CSV is normally the most easily identifiable, as it'll open up in Excel. So I can hit download and it'll download that to my machine. Now, I can actually user by user accept on a user's behalf. So I am actually logged in as the admin user right now, and I want to agree to this. So I can actually click here. So if I hover over it, it says not agreed. Click to agree to UAP. I want to agree to this. So it brings up consent detail. It's for admin user. It's the UAP policy. I can click that to be taken to it. I acknowledge that consents to these policies have been acquired. I can leave a remark if I want to. I'm just going to click I agree to this policy, and you'll see straight away it updates. So agreed, 9th of May, 9:28. I can also, from an admin's perspective, select multiple users and hit consent at the bottom and actually consent on several users' behalf if I want to. I agree to the policy, and that will just update these 3 users. So I'm not going to do that in this case, but it's worth being aware that it's there. And just click cancel. So that's how you actually review existing policy user agreements. So what we'll do now is look at the data registry. So one of the basic types of data requests that an individual can request under GDPR is a list of all processing and the reasoning behind it, including the retention period. So this particular data registry area within Moodle manages that conceptual data in the platform itself. So it allows you to define and set a purpose and retention periods, which I'll show you in a second, for data stored in Moodle. And you can organize these within categories as well. Because throughout Moodle, there's loads of different types of data related to users. It could be forum posts in a particular course. It could be assignments submitted for exams. There's vast amounts of categories rather of data. So you may wish to store these for different lengths of time. So if we bring up this other screen here, in fact, just before I expand that, you'll see at the bottom that there's some example. You may be holding administrative data. You've got personal life data. Obviously, you've got things like profile photos as well, as is covered by images, economic and financial information. You may want to store these all for different amounts of time. So if I go back to site administration and scroll down slightly, back to privacy and policies, here we've got data registry. So the second last area that we've not looked at yet. So the first thing you see on the left-hand side is a selection of different, I suppose, different levels within the platform. So you've got your site level, which encompasses everything from a site perspective. You've got a user level. You've got your categories, which I can expand and collapse. I'll just expand that for now. So these are items here with the folder icon. These are your categories, and then you've got your courses that sit within here, and then you can even drill down into specific blocks and activities within courses as well. So you can set very specific purposes and retention periods for very specific parts of the platform if you need to. I'm just going to collapse some of these for now. So what I'm actually going to do as an example is just select user. So this is the user information at a user level. I've already created a category. If you want a new category, you can just hit the plus icon. You enter a name and description. So I just created one called administrative, because it's going to be holding out administrative data, for example, at a user level. And then a purpose. So if I just click the plus here, because I've already set one, you provide a name. You can provide a description that's just going to help you identify it based on the name. You've then got a very important setting, and that's the actual retention period. So how long are you going to store this data for? So you've got days, months, and years. And this is a very important setting as well, protected. So if I tick this, retention of this data has a higher legal precedent over a user's request to be forgotten. So this data will only be deleted after the retention period has expired, if I tick that checkbox. So it's a very important setting to be aware of. So if I click cancel, so I've already created, as I say, this administrative category, and the purpose I've left as holding for 1 year. It holds a user's identity, and it's going to be held for a year. That's my naming convention there. You can name it whatever you like. So I could have not set it to use the default way, or it could be inherited from the level above that, essentially. So leave that on there, and then save my changes. So it's just a way of organizing how long different parts of your data are going to be stored for. It might not necessarily be something that you would come to change in here, but there may be certain user cases that come to light and you think, oh, actually, we should only be storing this for certain amounts of time, in which case you can come to this area to do that. So moving on from managing the data registry, we now get to look at how we actually submit subject access requests and how we manage these. So firstly, what is a subject access request in an SAR? Well, it's a written request made by or on behalf of an individual for the information which they're entitled to ask for under Section 7 of the Data Protection Act. But there's a few things to be aware of surrounding this area, particularly for schools that are going to have younger users, because you're going to have a range of users. If you're a training company, for example, you may only allow access for over 18s, in which case this probably won't be an issue at all. So a student or someone acting on their behalf has the right to make a request, which I will show you, to see any personal data their school holds about them and why. So to be fair, that's not just Moodle, that's anything. All pupils will have a right to see their own personal information, and if they ask for it, it has to be provided under GDPR. Parents, however, are only entitled to access the personal information held about their child if the child is unable to act on their own behalf, or if the child has given consent to their parent actually accessing that data. So even if the child is young, very young, that personal data being held, whether it's Moodle or outside of Moodle, it's still their personal data. It doesn't belong to anybody else, including their parents or guardians. So before you can actually respond to a subject access request as well, you need to consider as a school or a company, but particularly as a school, whether the child is actually mature enough to understand their rights. So if they are, obviously if they're in nursery school, that's unlikely, or reception. But if they are, then your response to a request should go straight to the child, not the parents. Obviously, parents still have the right to see the child's educational records, but some of this personal information is obviously slightly different to that. So within Moodle itself, each user will have the ability to submit a subject access request to the site admin and the data protection officer. So in the first step, we already created this data protection officer and we allowed them certain permissions to manage the data registry and manage subject access requests. So we've already done that, that role exists. So what I'll do now is show you it from a student's perspective. So I'm just going to log out of this platform that I'm on and log in as a student. So bear with me one moment. So if I expand this area, so I'm logged in as a student right now on this particular platform. So the first thing I would need to do is actually access my profile. Obviously this is theme dependent on how a user does this. But if you click at the top right on this particular theme, we've got profiled on this user menu. And a lot of themes follow this similar pattern. So if I click on profile, the first thing I need to do, and this is a good time for it to pop up on my screen, is I've logged in, I've saved that new version of the user acceptance policy. I actually need to accept this first before I go any further on the platform. So I'm going to click on next. It warns me before continuing. I have to tick, I agree. I'm going to click on next, and then it will actually take me to where I've selected. So that was quite appropriate timing. So I'm a student, I'm on this platform, I've gone to my user profile. I have 3 areas here. So the first one I'm actually going to mention, slight sidestep, is policies and agreements. I've just accepted this, so I can see I've agreed to it at 9:36 a.m. on the 9th of May. I've got the version number and the type, and I can click on that as well. I can also see a previous version that I have accepted as well. So I accepted this on the previous version on the 1st of May. If I just come out of here a moment, I've got 2 areas. I've got Contact Data Protection Officer and Data Requests. So if I had a general query, for example, about how my data was stored or where it's stored, so I don't necessarily want an export, and I don't want it to be deleted, I can click Contact Data Protection Officer. So this is the email address of the user that is making that request. And this is the actual message that I'm sending out to the data protection officer and the site admin. So I could type something in here and click send, and it would send that off to the subject access request area, which we will look at. What I actually want to do in this case is look at data requests, because that's a little bit more specific. So I can see that I've already requested, when I was doing a bit of testing, an export of my personal data and deletion of my personal data as well. So I've got actions. I can cancel my requests if I want to. So if I could cancel this, do you really want to cancel this data request? Cancel. Let's cancel this one as well. Request not found. Okay, great. So what I'm actually going to do is create a brand new data request. I'm clicking new request. I then have a drop down. So I've got export all of my personal data or export all of my personal data. So I want to ask for an export of my personal data, and I'll leave a quick comment. Please provide me with my personal data. Nice and simple. And hit save changes. I already have an ongoing request, so I won't be able to do that, but I'll be able to manage this request that already exists anyway. So I've already requested this. I can't request it multiple times. If I just move this to the other screen, I'm going to log in as an administrator. Bear with me 2 moments. And show you how to actually manage these requests. So once again, from an admin's perspective, site admin, privacy and policies, and there's a data requests area. And you can view all submitted requests and using a drop down beside each one, as you can see in this screenshot here on the presentation, there'll be certain actions available depending on if they've been approved or denied, or if they're pending or in process, etc. If I bring this back over here, go back to site admin, scroll down to privacy and policies, I have data requests. Here we go. So I've got several items in here that I've just been testing with recently, along with any available actions beside them. So I can see I've got an export that's awaiting approval here for the student user. So if I just, if I click on actions, I can view, approve, or deny. So I could actually make a request here as well, whether it be on behalf of myself, or because I'm an admin, I can actually choose a different user to make a request on behalf of. But I don't want to do that, so I'm just going to hit cancel. So I've got an export here that I want to deal with. It's awaiting approval. I click on actions. I'm not going to approve or deny yet. I'm going to click on view the request. So this is an export of all my personal data. This is the name of the student. Click on this, it'll take me through to their profile. That's their email address, the date this was requested. I can click review data. It will just take me back to the screen. There's no data to be shown at the moment. And I can approve or deny this as well. So in this case, let's say I approve this particular request, because I do. Click on approve. Do you really want to approve this request? Approve request. You can see the status has changed to approve. Each time an individual does actually make a request, it will send an email, providing you've set up email on your server. It will send an email to the data protection officer and administrator. If I now click on actions, I've just got view the request here as well. So if I very quickly log back in as the student. Log in as the student user. And just to expand this up here, I have 3 notifications as well, and you can see I have a notification in the platform because these have been enabled as well. So data request, export of my personal data. So I can click on this and it'll take me through, and I can see it's either been marked as complete or processing, and I can download this data. So rather than an admin necessarily having to download and export the data and send that over, I've been notified. So if email's set up, I'll have received an email, and if internal notifications are set up, I'll have a notification such as this. So I can click actions, click on download, and it will download an export.zip. So there's a number of files in here. I believe the data is stored in I think this is right how you say it, in JSON format. So you will be able, the users will be able to open that data, I believe, in text editors as well. So the data will be there essentially. And that's how you actually manage the subject access request. So site admins and the data protection officer should have the ability to come and manage these requests. So if a request for deletion is approved as well, then that user should receive an email and a notification to inform them, and they will no longer be able to log into the site, essentially. Obviously, you could deny that as well, which would prevent that from happening. So in summary, aside from spending a lot of time in site admin, what we've looked at today is we've covered the new tools. So we looked at the data privacy plugin and how you create and manage subject access requests. And we've also looked at how you can actually manage your data registry by creating categories and purposes with these data retentions. We also looked at the policies plugin. So that's the new user sign-on process. So that's the digital age of consent if you use self-registration. We looked at the ability to define multiple policies, create these policies, choose your policy type, and choose your user type as well. So all users in our case, we want everybody to accept things. We also looked at how admins can track user consents and consent on other users' behalf. And we also had a look at how we actually manage the version numbers, the updates, and how you can make minor changes. And whilst we looked at these 2 plugins, we kind of followed a rough kind of eight-step plan, I suppose. So as I said, we looked at creating that initial data protection officer role and assigning a user to that role so they've got the ability to manage these data requests. We then had a look through a selection of the privacy settings and policy settings to make sure they're set correctly, to make other options that we need available present on the platform. We moved on to look at the privacy policies and how you create them. And consequently, that we then looked at the user agreements and the consenting, which I've just mentioned. Moving from that, logically, it made sense to look at the data registry and how long we actually store this information for, and creating these different areas and potentially grouping all sites or several sites into a category to store the data for different lengths of time. And then we looked at the submitting and managing of subject access requests as well. So asking for the exportation, asking for the export of data or the deletion of data or any general queries as well. So it could just be general text comments that are kind of sent alongside that. Before we wrap this up, there's also several useful links that I do want to mention. One of them is an official Moodle doc. That's the top link there, which has some information about GDPR for administrators. And the second two links are some of our Titus learning useful links. So we've got one to our privacy policy, which might be useful to check out, and one that contains some information in regards to GDPR and schools, and particularly international schools as well. So it's worth taking a look at those two. So I haven't had any questions come through on the chat, but does anybody have any questions now I've reached the end of the webinar? Or if you do, just type it into the chat. I'll give it a moment or two, just in case somebody is typing. Okay, yep, ask away. And I'll do my best to answer it. I don't see a question yet, but I presume you're still typing it. Oh, there we go. Okay. Did you run into a particular problem? Which area were you looking at when you ran into a problem? Policy settings. Okay, ask away. If it's not a quick one, or I think I need to look into it a bit more, I'll contact you directly. But please do ask in the chat now, because it may help other people. So I'm in site administration, and I am currently looking at privacy and policies and policy settings, which is where you said you had the question. There's three options in there. There's the site policy handler, and then there's site policy URL and site policy URL for guests. So the site policy URL and the site policy URL for guests is essentially not using Moodle. It's using an external source that a user is actually going to have to accept. So you're not using the core Moodle functionality. The top setting, the site policy handler, is set to default core. So I'll just move this over here onto this screen. So you've got default core. If you want to utilize the settings within Moodle itself, you will need to change that to policies, tool policy. Otherwise, just open up a new tab. If I go to site admin, if manage policies and user agreements will not be present. If that doesn't answer your particular problem, your particular query, send an email to support@tituslearning.com. Feel free to do that now. And myself or a colleague will pick that up. The same goes for everybody else. If anybody does think of any additional questions or have any queries while you're having a play, or you've forgotten anything in a few days' time, this webinar has been recorded as well. So I will get that sent out. But that last query that's come in, I'll contact you directly on that one. So we'll make sure we get that sorted. But thank you very much for everybody's time. Just to reiterate what I've just said, any further questions, please let us know at support@tituslearning.com, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you very much.